We're going to build the whole unit circle today. We're going to take a look at the things that we've learned from the previous videos and then translate it. So hopefully you've already watched fingernometry, and then my references to that will help you remember the unit circle based off of what you know just from the first quadrant. So within this, you can see the triangles that we built from the previous lesson. So here was the pattern that we saw. So first of all, the angle measures are hopefully at this point you guys have it memorized. So we can see that the 30-degree angles are there, the 45, and then the 60-degree angles. So in the video that you had seen on fingernometry, we saw that this coordinate point first we start off with is a radius of 1, would give us that coordinate point right here would be 1, 0, and then the coordinate point of the quadrantal angles at the top would be 0, 1. Okay, so 1 is equivalent to radical 4 over 2. So if we go in a counterclockwise fashion for the x coordinates or cosine, we see that it's radical 3 over 2. If we deduct the previous value inside the radical by 1, radical 2 over 2, radical 1 over 2, and then eventually radical 0 over 2. Okay, so the values, when we simplify it, we do get 1, 0 at 0. Radical 3 over 2, we can't simplify. Radical 2 over 2, we can't simplify. Radical 1 over 2 is the same, square root of 1 is the same thing as 1, so I'm going to change this to 1/2. And then ultimately 0 being here, we don't need to write square root of 0 over 2. Working in a clockwise fashion, if I start off at 90 degrees and do the same thing where this is 1 is the same thing as radical 4 over 2, and then go clockwise, radical 3 over 2, radical 2 over 2, radical 1 over 2, which is 1/2, and then radical 0 over 2, which is 0. Okay, and we want to remember that when we're doing the unit circle, that the x value is associated with the cosine function, and then the y value is associated with the sine function. Something else that we had learned in the previous video was that all the trig functions were positive in the first quadrant. Students, this is the acronym. All students take calculus. So third quadrant is T, and then fourth quadrant is C. So for S, sine is positive because it makes sense if this is the xy coordinate that in this quadrant, in the first quadrant you have both our x and y are positive. In the second quadrant you have x is negative, y is positive. In the third, both are negative, and in the fourth, you have a positive and a negative, a positive x value and a negative. So it makes sense that sine in the second quadrant is positive because sine is y, and y is positive in that quadrant. For the third quadrant, you have t, so s is your sine function is positive. T is what trig function starts with a t, tangent. Tangent is positive, and C stands for cosine, and cosine is positive. Well, it makes sense in the third quadrant that tangent is positive because you have a ratio of y over x, and a negative over a negative is positive. It makes sense that cosine is positive in the fourth quadrant because a positive x value would mean that cosine is also positive. So now what we're going to do is take what we learned about this triangle here, which has the same reference angle as this triangle here, and take the values we know from the first quadrant and translate it to the other 3 quadrants using what we know about sines to adjust the signs as we go. So focusing in on that triangle I highlighted, the coordinate point for this angle right here, if I'm trying to do the same thing as I did over here, then the coordinate points will have the same values for the ratio. So I'd write rad 3 over 2 and 1/2, and then adjust the signs accordingly. This coordinate point has a negative x value and a positive y value. So my x would be negative, my y would be positive. So that's true of everything in the second quadrant. So I'm going to go ahead and put a negative at all the x coordinates with 180 degrees being negative, the coordinate point being negative 1, 0. Now, if you go ahead and take a look at the next triangle, you have the 45, 45, 90 degree triangle, and this coordinate point, again, would have the same values as what you see on the 45, 45, 90 triangle in your first quadrant. And then lastly, this would be negative 1/2 radical 3 over 2. Now, if we start with the same triangle in the third quadrant, you see that that triangle there has a reference angle of 30 degrees. So what we do from there is use the same coordinate points, except adjust for the signs. And the signs are both negative in the third quadrant. So we can go ahead and even put the negative signs all throughout the coordinate points, with this coordinate point being 0, -1. Okay, if we go ahead and fill out this, I'm going to have you guys hit pause and try to figure out what the rest of the third quadrant is and the fourth quadrant. So hopefully you got rad 2 over 2, or in fact, negative rad 2 over 2 and negative rad 2 over 2, negative 1/2, negative rad 3 over 2. Okay, in the fourth quadrant, you see that all the x values for these points should be positive and all the y values should be negative. So I'm going to go ahead and put negative signs for the y values. At this point, you should know that this is rad 2 over 2. And then lastly, we end with rad 3 over 2 and then 1/2. So if you have any questions on this, I would encourage you guys to shoot me an email, hopefully between the fingernometry, the first quadrant lesson, and then now this lesson, you should be able to build the entire unit circle on your own. And I'm just taking a brief look at it, and I see that I missed this as negative rad 3 over 2. So I encourage you guys to try to time yourself as you do this.